In this brief video, I want to clarify what we are talking about when we talk about dyslexia. In our discussion of the processes involved in skilled reading, we have seen that there are different representations and stages involved. When someone starts with a written text and read it for understanding the text, while optionally pronouncing it aloud. But if they're skilled readers, they will probably skip the speaking part and just go to understanding in silent reading. And as we've seen, all these processes can be broken down and categorized into two major groups. One concerns what we call word level processing, which concerns reading single words and word sequences. So everything that takes place along this level, this is the word level, which includes the sequencing. And there is also text level processing, which is up here and concerns comprehension. So this one concerns taking into account multiple words and their combinations together, along with their syntax and their meaning, to understand the meaning of the whole text. These two different kinds, these two different levels of processing also help us distinguish between potential problems at the word level from potential problems at the text level. And as it turns out, because these stages here are shared with oral language, splitting the different kinds of possible problems into corresponding areas, we have language problems, speech problems, more general cognitive problems, and only here, actual reading problems. Problems in these domains are what we call dyslexia, and these affect word level processing. Problems that do not involve word level processing but affect reading comprehension are located here, and they include language problems and possibly more general cognitive problems. If someone has primary problems with comprehension rather than with decoding. So from this classification, it is clear that dyslexia concerns difficulty with the mapping of the written elements to the spoken elements and the learning of the corresponding representations, including the learning of orthographic word forms and their connections to phonological word forms, and then directly with word meanings. This is what we refer to by saying dyslexia in terms of which domains are affected, which are the relevant issues and the relevant skills that are affected when we talk about dyslexia. However, this is not the best way to think about dyslexia, although it is a correct way, because it doesn't help guide assessment and intervention. It just helps locate dyslexia within this general picture of relevant skills that go into reading a text for understanding it. It helps us narrow down our domain to where the problems that may occur are actually reading specific problems. The more useful way to think about this is to remember that learning to read is a sequence of building on prerequisites, in the sense that in order to achieve the next level of ability, you need to have already conquered a number of previous levels, of previous steps. And as you recall, starting from the very beginning, where a child has learned to communicate orally, there is a large number of steps that must be taken successfully in order for the child to eventually become a skilled reader. First of all, we need some basic phonological awareness, whereby the child can turn their attention to the words and their larger parts, such as syllables, whether words rhyme, so that they begin to think about and of words. And subsequently, we need at least some phonemic awareness, the ability to match and isolate phonemes first in the beginnings of words and then within words. We also need some letter knowledge. The child must become familiar with the shapes of the different letters and learn that they correspond to some sounds or names, to be able to name the letters somehow, and subsequently realize that these letter sounds aren't just names, but they are the same thing as the parts of words. So letter knowledge simply involves the ability to respond with a name or sound to a visual form, but understanding of the alphabetic principle refers to the realization that the letter sounds are phonemes, are parts of one's words. This enables learning to read, and then the child can begin to sound out syllables and then words, starting with letters and blending. Learning to blend is a very demanding step. Once this is mastered, then the child can learn multi-letter and context-dependent graphemes. So not just single letters that correspond to phonemes, but letter combinations that correspond to phonemes. And from that point on, the child starts to become familiar with larger chunks, including syllables, frequent morphemes, and whole words, leading to the ability to recognize common words rapidly. Individual frequent words are recognized easily and rapidly, and that leaves out capacity for dealing with the less familiar words. The next step is to be able to read word sequences such as lists, but also sentences, rapidly and without effort. These are the first steps of fluency, leading into fluent reading of texts with comprehension. So decoding has become sufficiently effortless and efficient that a child can actually understand the meaning of the sentence while they are reading it, which eventually leads to rapid silent reading for learning. This is where reading is no longer an issue, and the reader uses reading in order to learn from the text. What we commonly see in someone who has dyslexia is that they're not really good at this. But to look at this last stage, or maybe administer a reading test and realize that this part here isn't quite as efficient as it should be for the age and opportunities provided, this is just the tip of the iceberg. So dyslexia isn't so much that this doesn't work, although this is how it obviously manifests itself in someone who should by that age and stage been a more skilled reader. Dyslexia is the fact that this sequence hasn't quite worked well. Something could have been at the beginning, or it could have been at some other point. Something hasn't quite fallen in with the rest of the pieces. Something was missing, something was hindered, something was delayed, something was too difficult. If anything here is too difficult, then everything that follows it will also be too difficult, incomplete, and inadequate. So dyslexia is some fault along this process. Often the fault is near the beginning, which means that if you have evidence that someone has trouble down here, which is the obvious behavioral manifestation of dyslexia, dyslexia is not here. Dyslexia is the fact that something further up, so back even maybe before starting school, something there wasn't operating as efficiently and effectively as it should have been, for that person to be able to learn to read adequately. So dyslexia is a broken reading development process. And the way to think of it and the way to address it is to use assessment wisely to identify where the problem begins. Often it begins at the beginning, which means that intervention will also have to go back and begin here so that you can supply the missing or incomplete or inadequate building blocks for the subsequent steps to be taken successfully and efficiently and eventually improve these final points. So what we're talking about when we talk about dyslexia is a delayed, hindered, or derailed reading development process, which has to do with word level processing and reading specific processes.